Asya Sarvadharmaswarupini Avataravarishthaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. So we are slowly approaching the end of our discussion of Nagarjuna system known as Madhyamika system, which is one of the idealistic schools of Buddhist philosophy belonging to Mahayana system, the other being the Yogacara or Vijnanavada. She also equally important, especially when we discuss topics like mindfulness. The Yogacara system is much more relevant. So I was trying to give a brief analysis of the foundational ideas of three of Nagarjuna's most important books. The fundamental canon of Shunyavada is Mula Madhyama Karika or Mula Madhyama Shastram. That is the foundational verses on the middle way. And is the most important work, almost 450 verses in 27 chapters. He systematically analyzes the core Buddhist concepts, casualities, self-time, liberation, and so on. The next in importance, according to many of the scholars, there are different views with regard to what is the next most important work after Madhyamika Karika. But Vigrahavyavartani is very important because that gives you a glimpse into the intricate dialectical system employed by Nagarjuna. And this is very clearly stated in the first verse itself. And the interesting thing is that Vigrahavyavartani, which means the dispeller of all disputes, doubts, and diverse views, or the end, the culmination of disputes. Now, in this book, which is a dialectical defense of the Madhyamika position against critics who raise objections to Nagarjuna, and the most important objection is discussed in the first verse itself, on which Nagarjuna wrote a very wonderful celebrated commentary. It brings out the essence of what we studied earlier. I mean, the reductio ad absurdum. I mean, it's a prasanga method. Without stating your own position, you accept as if you are accepting the objector's view, and then you bring out, you reveal all the inherent contradictions and fallacies of that system, and then you withdraw without saying anything. Means when you demolish the opponent's objections, then there is nothing more for you to say because you don't have anything to state. So your view gets automatically accepted. Prasanga. I mean, the reductio ad absurdum. You bring out the absurdities of the inconsistencies of the opposing system. So from a dialectical perspective, Vigrahavyavartani is as important as Mula Madhyama Karika. And the third one which I am planning to discuss is Ratnavali, which shows you an entirely different picture of Nagarjuna, the man. He was a great humanist, and he indirectly discusses a very interesting subject, the paradox of how the most incompetent person becomes the most powerful in a society. Very often we find this happening. A cruel, monstrous person who is totally unfit to rule a country becomes a ruler. So he gives a list of the essential fundamental qualities of an ideal ruler, a king. So it is a didactic kind of work in verses addressed to a king, outlining the important qualities for an ideal king, philosopher king. And the uniqueness of the book is he states that when a king, when a ruler realizes the truth of Shunya, I mean the reality of absence of intrinsic essence of anything in this world. When you realize that there is absolutely really nothing that is intrinsically right, intrinsically real, then you practice compassion, you become very even-minded in doing justice to your subjects. You don't take any side because you know there is nothing for you to achieve. Everything is part of the dependent origination, pratitya samutpada. Everything in this world is devoid of any inherent essence, any inherent intrinsic existence. So why do you accumulate money, wealth, status? Because everything is intrinsically, essentially devoid of any reality. So once a ruler realizes this truth, he becomes a real philosopher king as outlined in Plato's Republic. So there is a spiritual aspect to an ideal king, to being an ideal king. Because injustice, cruelty, lack of compassion that you find in an administrator, because that was the time of monarchies. So naturally, he's addressing his instructions to a monarch, to a king in Ratnavali. So in Ratnavali, it is a didactic work, instructional, addressing a king, 500 verses. The shortest of these three works is Vigrahavyavartani, which is only 72 verses. At least there are 2-3 editions. In some editions, maybe 1 or 2 verses more. In the standard edition, which I have got in my possession, there are only 72 verses in the Vigrahavyavartani. So after giving a brief outline of these two books, Ratnavali and Vigrahavyavartani, first I shall take up Nagarjuna's unique style of dialectics. So as I mentioned, in the Ratnavali, the personal ethics, happiness, path to liberation, social justice, advice, the importance of being detached while performing kingly duties and responsibilities, all these are mentioned very clearly in a very compassionate, very polite, very mild language. Nagarjuna addresses this problem. In in Vigrahavyavartani, as I mentioned earlier, which is a dialectical classic, which is different, its structure is different, and is a much more serious book. In a way, it is as important as the original Mula Madhyama Shastra. So I am going to take up a few important verses from this. So I shall take up one important part from Vigrahavyavartani. Those who have, I don't know, it is translated into English. So as an example of Nagarjuna's unique method or prasanga method, he is, first of all, is taking up an objection. And the most important objection to Nagarjuna was that the concept of Shunya, absence of any intrinsic inherent reality, which he considers the supreme principle, applies to his own philosophy as much as to anything else. The world is Shunya. If everything is Shunya, then your doctrine of Shunya also is Shunya. So I shall take up this, in the first verse of Vigrahavyavartani is Sarvesham bhavanam sarvatra na vidyate subhavaschet tuts vajanam asubhavam na nivartayidum subhavam alam. This is the first verse in Vigrahavyavartani. Sarvesham bhavanam sarvatra na vidyate. If everything in this world is devoid of an intrinsic nature, swabhava, and this absence of intrinsic nature, absence of any essential nature or reality of everything is the foundational philosophy, then your statement must also be devoid of any intrinsic nature, aswabhava. That's why sarvesham bhavanam sarvatra vidyate swabhavaschet. If everything in this world, bhava here means things, mountains, valleys, rivers, everything in this world, bhava, anything that has come into existence. All those things that belong to the category of praditya samutpada, dependent origination. Human beings, all, they are conditioned in their origination. They come, they go, and then everything is an effect of something else, and everything is a cause of something else. So, apart from this, nothing in this world has any intrinsic or inherent essential existence. If that is your philosophy, sarvesham bhavanam sarvatra na vidyate swabhavaschet. If the swabhava, or rather the intrinsic nature of everything in this world is the absence of an intrinsic nature. I mean, absence of essential nature is the essential nature of everything in this world. So you can imagine the problem of language. Shunya is the nature of everything in this world. What is Shunya? Shunya implies the absence of any intrinsic existence or reality of anything. That is sarvesham bhavanam swabhavaha Shunya. That means, what is the characteristic of things in this world? Sunyata. What is Shunya? Shunya implies the absence of any intrinsic existence of anything in this world. Then, tud vachanam asubhavam. In that case, your own word, your own statement. What is your statement? Your statement is the Shunya. Nagarjuna's statement is everything is Shunya. That statement also is devoid of any intrinsic nature. So asubhava. Tud vachanam asubhavam. Your word, your statement is asubhava. Means devoid of any subhava, devoid of any intrinsic reality. It is also part of the praditya samutpada. It is also part of the Shunya. In that case, what does it mean? Everything in this world has a reality. If you deny, if Nagarjuna's own statement amounts to a refutation of his own statement, then what it means is everything in this world is real. That's the point. Suppose you say nothing in this world is essentially real, existent. And that statement is wrong. Then what does it mean? Everything in this world is existent. Because Nagarjuna's own statement refutes the truth of his own statement. It demolishes the truth of his own statement. Now, in answer to this, in course of time, Nagarjuna, this is beginning, and this Nagarjuna himself very elaborately writes a commentary on this objection. In fact, he expands the objection to his own view in order to substantiate his view that there is nothing to be substantiated. That's the point. This language can create problems. Nagarjuna's answer to this is, I have no position to state. You said that my own statement is Shunya. That you are being so, if I have a statement to make, but I have no statement to make. The only thing I have to do is to demolish your statement. What is your statement? Everything is real. That is all non-Shunyavadins. Non-Madhyamikas say, Sarvastivada, Sautrantikas and Vaibhashikas, the Hinayana school. They believed in Sarvastivada. Sarvam asti iti sarvasti. Sabbam asti in Pali. So the original foundation books are in Pali. Tripitakas. Sabbam atti. Everything exists. That is the opposite of Nagarjuna's view. So Nagarjuna is countering these Sarvastivadins, those who believe the reality of objective world. So now remember, Nagarjuna is writing a book in which he begins his work with a refutation of his own philosophy. Then he elaborates this refutation. Then slowly he brings out the inconsistencies, the controversial points, the untenables of this objectivist view, and then he says, your philosophy has collapsed, so I don't have anything to say. That means my philosophy stands. That is Prasanga method. This is an important point. I mentioned this earlier. The Madhyamika tradition, there are two views, two main streams. One is Prasangika school of Chandrakirti and Buddha Palita and Arideva and others. And the Prasangika school of Chandrakirti. And then the Swatantriya school of Bhavya. Bhavya was a Greek philosopher. He also wrote a commentary on Mula Madhyama Shastra. He says, I have a position to state. I have not only to demolish your views, I have also to establish my views. So that is the opposite of Prasangya method. Prasangya method can roughly, you can relate it to the reductio ad absurdum, reducing the opponent's view into absurdity, or bringing out the absurdities of the opponent's view without stating your own view. That is the Prasanga method, Prasangika school, Chandrakirti and Buddha Palita. The other one is Swatantriya school. That is the school belonging to Bhavya, another philosopher. Now let us see how Nagarjuna reinforces a view that is opposite to him. So it's called Purvapaksha. Purvapaksha, literally Purvapaksha means a prima facie view. What you really feel like what it implies. But it is the prima facie may not be an accurate English rendering of Purvapaksha. Purvapaksha implies an objection based on a solid line of arguments meant to substantiate a philosophical doctrine, which opposes the mainstream, the received interpretation. That is Purvapaksha in Vedanta and Buddhism and Mimamsa everywhere. But anyway, it is a view which is going to be refuted. It's called Purvapaksha. Now, Siddhanta means a view that is going to be established after demolishing the objection to Purvapaksha. So Nagarjuna now comes into the scene. He says, Yadi sarvesham bhavanam hedu pratyayeshu cha hedu pratyaya samagryam cha pradakcha yatra sarvatra sabhavo na vidyade iti krutva shunyaha sarvabhavaha iti. That means, now the point is, if the intrinsic nature of things, whatever they may be, it doesn't exist anywhere, means Everything is devoid of intrinsic nature. Then your statement also belongs to that category. Now okay, this description says, whether the causes, it is sarvesham bhavanam hetu. Hetu means cause. Whether in the causes or in the conditions, or in the combination of causes, or in a different thing, nowhere does anything exist, nature of things, whatever they may be. On this ground, it is said that all things are void. Now the example is this. Let us take a seed. So that example comes here, Nahi bijehi hedubhude anguraha na asti na prithvi aptejo vayu adinam egaigasmin pratyesapnya iti na pratyeshu samagreshu na hedu pratyeshu samagreshu na hedu pratye samagriyam na hedu pratye vinirmukta prithak eva va yasman atra subhavo nasti tasman nisubhava anguraha yasman nisubhava tasman shunya yathacha ayam anguro nisubhavo nisubhavatva shunyaha tatha sarvabhavaha nisubhavata shunya iti. Now we will explain this. You take a seed and a sprout. Now the sprout doesn't exist in the seed, at least according to Buddhas. Buddhas do not believe in either in the philosophy held by Advaitins, Sankhyas and others. They don't accept the idea that the effect pre-exists in cause. They don't believe that. But for them, there is neither effect nor cause. That is according to Shunyavadins. So the point he says, the sprout of a seed doesn't exist in the seed. The sprout does not exist in the soil. It doesn't exist in the water used to irrigate the field. It doesn't exist in manure that you use to grow the sprout. So that means the sprout doesn't exist in the seed. It doesn't exist. Remember, you may not agree with this if you are an Advaitin or if you are a Sankhya philosopher. Because according to their school, they believe that every effect pre-exists in cause. It's an important philosophy here. It's called Satkaryavada. Karya means effect. Sat means existing. The effect pre-exists in the cause. The cloth pre-exists in the threads. The tree pre-exists in the seed. That's what they believe. It's called Satkaryavada. But Buddhists don't agree with that. Buddhist philosophers. So they say the sprout doesn't exist in the seed. Obviously, if the sprout exists in the seed, then you don't need to put in under the earth and pour water. It is sprout itself. That's the argument. The arguments come in forward in Nagarjuna system. If somebody says, no, the tree pre-exists in seed, then why do you take the trouble to plant the seed, pour water, mud and manure, everything? You work hard, you irrigate the field? No. Again say, if you say the cloth pre-exists in thread, then we can wear a thread. If you say the ornament pre-exists in gold, then why don't you wear a gold biscuit instead of an ornament? So they are asking these questions. That means they say, so the tree does not, or the sprout does not exist in the seed, and the sprout does not exist in the mud, in the soil, water, manure, anything. These are conditions. All these conditions, they don't exist. So in that case, that means earth, water, etc., wind, all these are needed for the seed to become sprout. But the sprout doesn't exist in any of these things. Or either in any of them independently, or any of them in combination of all these, the sprout doesn't exist. And again, it is not anything different from the causes and effects. Therefore, nothing has got anything that is eternal. Everything in this world is totally devoid of any intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence. So the sprout is devoid of an intrinsic nature. It's called Nisvabhava, he says. So being devoid of any intrinsic reality, the sprout is Shunya. And just as the sprout is Shunya, so also everything is Shunya. That is his argument. Now, here there is a view. I mean, they continue forward. Atra vayam brumaka. Here we have an observation to make. We are making an observation. If this is so remember here Nagarjuna is putting things in the mouth of his his opponent party, his opponent. So remember, it's an important method in the prasanga method. Many people sometimes some lawyers play this trick. Having made that clear, so you have to say, no, you have not made it clear, we don't accept it. If you don't immediately make the statement clear, no, we don't agree with you. So they take it for granted, as if you are already in full agreement with this view. Then from there they start another line of agreement. So you have to immediately say, no, we are not accepted the view. So Nagarjuna uses this method. So that's why, yadi evam tava api vachanam. If this is so, your word also is like that. So we say the sprout doesn't exist, the seed in the soil, in the manure, in the water, or the efforts that you make to make the seeds grow into sprout. The sprout doesn't exist either, and the sprout doesn't exist in sprout itself. If it existed, there is no need for you to plant a seed expecting a sprout to come up. The sprout doesn't exist. That's why you plant a seed. The sprout doesn't exist, the seed. The sprout doesn't exist, the sprout. So it has no real intrinsic reality. Then Nagarjuna says, Atra vayam brumaka. Here remember, these views are coming from Nagarjuna's opponent. But Nagarjuna is preparing the background to put forward his view forcefully by making a very elaborate argument against him, so that while trying to demolish these arguments, he can demolish all anti-Shunya views or views against Shunyavada, so that his Shunyavada gets automatically accepted and well received. So, Atra, in this context, we have this observation to make. Atra vayam brumaka. Yadi evam tava api vachanam, yadi edas shunyaga sarvabhava iti tadapi shunyam. If this is your view, then your word, tava vachanam, yadi edas shunyaga sarvabhava iti sarvabhavaga shunyaga. Everything in this world is shunya, means everything in this world is devoid of any intrinsic, inherent existence or reality. Iti vachanam tadapi shunyam. That statement also is shunya. If the statement is shunya, then what does it imply? Everything is real. Kim karanam? What's the reason? Tadapi hedo nasti mahabhudeshu samprayukteshu viprayukteshu va pratiyeshu nasti ura kantha aushta jikhva denda talu nastiga murdha prabhutishu yat naiva ubhaya samagryam asti prudak eva va nasti yasmat atra sarvatra nasti tasmat nisvabhavam yasmat Nisubhavam tasma shunyam. Now he says, you are making tava vachanam, you are making this statement. What is the statement? Shunya. What is that? It is a word. What is a word? The word is something that comes out of your vocal cords, your throat, talu, danda, jikhwa, your tongue, your vocal cords, all the, all those parts of the face, a human body, which are involved in making a word, in pronouncing a word shunya. After all, to pronounce, to articulate a word shunya, what do? You are using your mouth, your teeth, your nose, then many of the nasals you need, nose may be used, dentals, danda, teeth are to be used, tongue has to be used. All these vocal cords, different parts of the human body mechanism had to be involved, had to be used to pronounce the word shunya. So your statement is just a word only. And you make the statement, do you think by making the statement, everything in this world loses its intrinsic reality? That is opponent's view. So this statement is only a word. Everything in this world is devoid of intrinsic reality. That statement itself is only a word, shunya, that comes out of the vocal cords. Nothing else. Because your statement is neither in its cause. That means your statement, everything is shunya, that also is devoid of any existence. It is not in its cause. Mahabhuta, and there is some prayukteshu, viprayukteshu, etc. Need conditions. So you remember the statement. What are the conditions for the sprout? The soil in which the seed is planted, water that is used for irrigation, manure that is used for bringing the sprout, growing the seed. Air is needed, sunlight is needed. These are all conditions. All these conditions, in those conditions also shunya doesn't exist. Just as in soil, air, water, sunlight, which are all necessary for the seed to grow into sprout, the sprout doesn't exist. Similarly, the shunyada or the state of being shunya also doesn't exist anywhere else. And then it is not different from its cause, and it is not non-different from its cause. For this reason, just by making a statement, you cannot deny the intrinsic nature, the inherent reality of all these phenomenal entities. Just by saying everything is shunya, things don't become shunya. The Sanskrit language is very powerful. Very difficult to do full justice to the force and the focus and the ruthless dialectical nature of Nagarjuna's powerful statements. Prathak eva va nasti, yasmas atra sarvatra nasti, tasma nisubhavam, etc. He says, yasma nisubhavam, tasma shunyam. These things are devoid of any intrinsic nature of reality or existence. Therefore, it is shunya. Tasmat anena sarva bhava subhava vyavartanam ashakyam kartum. That is the conclusion of the opponents. Nagarjuna says. Of course, these views are articulated by Nagarjuna's opponent. He says, somebody who is trying to refute Shunyavada, the doctrine of Shunya. Tasmat anena sarva bhava subhava vyavartanam ashakyam kartum. Therefore, just by making a statement, everything is sarva bhava shunya. The statement Nagarjuna says. This statement cannot deny or remove the intrinsic nature of things in this world. They do have a reality, they do have a swabhava, they are not devoid of swabhava, they are not devoid of an intrinsic nature. Kim karanam, then he says, nahi asadaknina shakyam dagdhum. See, he used the word agni, means fire. Just a word comes up from your mouth. That word cannot burn anything. Asadaknina, fire that doesn't exist. A word fire without a corresponding entity that is fire, nothing can be burned. You need fire. The word fire, F-I-R-E, cannot burn anything. You need something that is an intrinsic nature, reality, that is fire. That only can burn anything. So the opponent, see, Nagarjuna is applying his own contribution to the opponent's view to reinforce, to strengthen the opponent's arguments so that he will get a chance to demolish all these arguments one after another. That is the point. See, preparing the background. So, nahi asadagnina shakyam dagdhum, nahi asada shastrena shakyam chetum. Use a word, let's say sword or needle, use something. You just by the word sword, you cannot hurt anyone. You cannot do that. By saying the word needle, you cannot hurt anyone. You need that entity. Just corresponds to the word needle. Scissor, you need a scissor. Not the word scissor, but the thing that's called scissor. That's what he says. In other words, this is actually lead to another argument which comes later. The view is you cannot have a word in this world without some corresponding reality. That is a view. Nagarjuna doesn't accept it. There is an ultra-realist in Indian philosophical system believed that a word cannot exist without some corresponding reality which is linked to that particular word. A word called milk would not have come into existence without some entity that corresponds to that thing which we call milk in English language, whatever language it is. But that is not accepted by Shunyavadins. So again he says, this argument, nahi asadibhihi adbhihi shakyam kledayidum. That means water. So, plural, that's why asadibhi adbhihi. Water cannot, the word water cannot make anything wet. You need a thing which you call water to make something wet. Evam asadavachanena na shakyaha sarvabhava pratishedha kartum. Means, just by making a statement that implies the non-existence of everything in this world, that's shunya, you cannot really rule out the possibility of things existing. Sarvabhava pratishedha means the refutation of the reality of things. It's not possible just by the word that you use, shunya. That is the opponent's view. Na sakyaka sarvabhava subhavo nivartayitum. I mean, the fundamental reality of things in this world cannot be refuted by making the statement sarvabhava shunyaha. The statement doesn't work. You have to remember here one thing, Buddhist philosophers make this frequently mention that this word Shunyata is only a designation based on something. If you negate everything without substantiating something, that negation cannot be valid. Negation itself implies negating something because you want to establish something positive. This argument is being put forward by the Swatantriya school of Bhavya. So negation is only in thought. In itself, negation is only non-relational knowledge, realization, a kind of mystical experience of the Absolute. So what is Shunya? Shunya is only non-relational realization or experience of the Absolute. If you make it a relational word, you can say Sarvam Brahma, you can say. Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma in Vedanta. If you make it a relational statement. If you make it a non-relational statement, if you take the perspective of a non-relational knowledge of the Absolute, then you go on denying everything, finally you keep quiet, as Nagarjuna did. What is that? And he says somewhere, silence is the knowledge, is the language of Shunya. That is very much a part of the mainstream Advaitic Shankara Vedanta. That is you can see the Veda mantra is there. Antaye Bhuvadinam Anantaye Mukam. When you want to explain something, the empirical, the phenomenal, the diverse entities, Bhuvadinam, you can speak so much, you can write so much, you can write a book. But when you are talking, when you are trying to say something about the infinite, then the only language you can use is the language of silence. Nagarjuna frequently comes to that in some contexts. So you can ask questions further. This is just giving a classical style of the Prasangya method. Nagarjuna's defense comes later on. But once we understand how Nagarjuna himself puts forward possible objections to his own philosophy, then you can understand, you can get a clear picture of how his dialectics evolved slowly. As for Ratnavali, as I mentioned earlier, it is a book, didactic, instructional book advising kings, ethical conduct and happiness, virtuous qualities, judging character, for example. There are many, many interesting statements in Ratnavali. Even judging human character using the simile of mangoes, Nagarjuna says, for example. Some people, he is trying to explain, describe human characteristics. Some people appear ripe but are green. Some are green but, some appear to be green but are ripe. Some are green and are green. Some are ripe, and so on. But one thing that he makes again and again, statements he makes again and again, is that it is impossible for a king to be a compassionate, moral, ethical person without realizing Shunyata. So when you realize Shunyata, you develop a kind of higher insight and instinct, higher instinct. It's not the animal's instinct. When you instinctively do the right thing, when it becomes impossible for you to do anything wrong, you become instinctively spiritually wise. That means that is the deliberate action, the deliberate effort to do justice should become an instinct. And that is what we call wisdom. That happens when you realize everything is Shunya. When you realize everything is Shunya, then you are not attached. You become impartial. You have no anger towards anyone. So you become fully established in the ideal of justice and compassion in your treatment of subjects and other fellow human beings. It begins very interestingly, it begins with a homage to Buddha. sarvadosha vinirmuktam gunai sarvai alankritam pranamya sarvajñamaham sarvasattviga badhavam. So this is how he begins his Ratnavali. I bow down to this great teacher, omniscient, Sarvajñam. He calls Buddha Sarvajña, the all-knowing. Pranamya Sarvajñam, Aham Sarvashaktiga Badhavam. I bow down to this omniscient, the great teacher, who is free from all defects, Sarvadosha Vinirmuktam. And then he is adorned with all qualities, Gunaihi, Sarvaihi Gunaihi Alankritam. He is adorned by all auspicious qualities. He is the one and only friend of all beings. Sarva Sattvega Bandhava means he is the Bandhavaga, he is a friend, relative, so to speak, of all beings. So, this is how he begins the instruction. And slowly, he elaborates on the qualities of Buddha. And he says these qualities should guide and inspire an ideal king. Saddhaya samsayarthan prajna pashyati tattvadaha saddhaya labhyate dharma prajnaya chaviparyaha. So, you should have strong faith and should rely upon practices. You should have wisdom. And you should know that wisdom. And saddhaya labhyate dharma prajnaya chaviparyaha. And he says the wisdom is more important. Faith is necessary, but wisdom is the supreme virtue, he says. Then there are certain qualities, virtues mentioned. These are all, the first verse itself is an example. His great reverence for Buddha. Sarvadosha vinirmuktam gunai sarvaihi alankritam, etc. He is describing Buddha as a supreme wise teacher of supreme spiritual wisdom, who is omniscient, who is free from all human defects, and is a repository of all auspicious qualities, and is the one and only friend of all beings, not only human beings. Sarva Sattvega Bandhava means Ega Bandhava means a one good friend, sole friend of all entities, all beings. Ahimsa chanudam chaiva sthayamityavi parushum paishunam samudam chaiva kamakrodhu tathaiva cha. Freedom from all these qualities. Freedom from all these defects like himsa, vice and so on. One should be free from violence. That is why ahimsa is mentioned. In the commentaries you mentioned, qualities are sometimes mentioned in positive or in negative language. Ahimsa means absence of himsa. So again, another means absence of stealing, not stealing. Steya, absence of committing adultery from false, and then freedom from harshness, falsehood, reckless, senseless speech, and so on. Vaishunyam, samudam chaiva, kamakrodhu tathaiva cha. It goes on. These are all qualities listed as absolutely necessary for every ideal king. And how to deal with people, how to show compassion. There are verses which indicate that a king should also be compassionate, not only to human beings but also to animals, to all living beings. Sarvada snehapurvam cha rogino anadha dukkhidan deenan daridra pididamscha yatnena paripalayet is a very, very great statement. You should always care with great compassion. People who are sick, people who are unprotected, no one to protect them, no one to take care of them, people who are suffering or stricken with some problems, those who are at the lower ladder of human society, those who are suffering with poverty, Deenan daridya pididansha yatnena paripalayet. They should work hard, take special care to nourish, to protect, and to serve with great compassion and love. Sarvada snehapurvam cha rogino anatha dukkhidan. I don't know if you find such instructions in any other books, directly addressed to a king. So a king is asked to take care of those who are poor, unprotected, those who are at the lower levels of human society. They should be taken proper care of. As I mentioned earlier, Buddhism was in a way a kind of reform movement within Hinduism against the orthodoxy. Hinduism used charity, compassion as part of individual virtues to be practiced. And there are also statements in the Smritis which is made that every king should practice. But for a long time this was forgotten or were neglected. So Buddhism came as a reform movement to remind the people of the country about these ancient virtues. There is also great emphasis on altruism. You have to remember this book belongs to 3rd century AD, Nagarjuna's time. Yatha swarte sada chintam kuryat atmahide sada tatha pararthaya abhi sada chintayet sattva sampadan. So, just you are thinking of your own welfare, your intent on thinking of what could be done for your own good. So also, you should be thinking about what you could do to make others happy. So, some of these values you find in the Valmiki Ramayana. The joy of a king is the joy of a subject. The people, those days of monarchies, remember. But many of these ideas are again forcefully articulated by Nagarjuna. Anyway, so we can have interaction, we'll continue our discussion on Ratnavali for some time, maybe another session. Then we'll switch over to Yogacara system, which is equally important in the Buddhist tradition. Thank you. You are most welcome with questions.
Thank you very much, Maharaj.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll focus on Ratnavali since you did. You touched on how remarkable it is in the canon of world literature that it has these direct instructions to powerful leaders, kings, with the expectation that they'll rise to the level of exquisite philosophy. And the philosophy is very pithily but cleverly articulated. And then there are other elements in it that ridicule the absence of these qualities also. I'm looking at, for example, verse 28. The I exist, mine exists. These are wrong as ultimates. But the two are not established. Oh, no, I'm actually looking at the wrong verse. Verse 26. I am not, I will not be. I have not, I will not have. That frightens all the childish and extinguishes fear in the wise. I mean, the idea that the absence of these virtues is immature, it just lays it out there very, very directly. It's an unusual work of literature.
Yeah, very forceful language. So this ruthless dialectician was a great humanist. That's what is so surprising about Nagarjuna.
My next question, while awaiting others, and I do see he's on the YouTube. I'll ask that next. My next question is: you spoke about how the Buddhism emerged as a reform movement,
Yeah.
and then a few centuries later,
Yeah.
Shankaracharya is engaged in fierce philosophical debates
Yeah.
with opponents that are sometimes described as Buddhists.
Yeah.
So what happened to Buddhism between the time of Nagarjuna and the time of Shankaracharya?
Yeah.
That because there are so many comparisons,
Yeah.
but there obviously was more going on by that time.
Yeah. We have to remember Nagarjuna appeared almost 750 years after Buddha's time. So Shankaracharya came about 400 years after Nagarjuna. So if we look at the historical timeline, you find Buddhism became a kind of all-negating, life-negating nihilism by the time of Shankaracharya. So after Nagarjuna, you find the Yogacara system, Vijnanavada, became more prominent. Dignaga was a great Vijnanavada philosopher. And in Vijnanavada, there are two levels of evolution. One is Ale Vijnanavada and Pravritti Vijnanavada. At some point, Vijnanavada became a kind of extreme kind of nihilism. And then many of these virtues were practically neglected and they were forgotten. And then that must have resulted in some new movements in within Buddhism, which reduced Buddhism to the status of a dry idealism, all negating idealism. If you want a proof, you can see in Shankaracharya's references to Buddhists of those times. They were denying everything. So you have to remember, Nagarjuna talks about the virtues, the qualities, the superhuman spiritual qualities of an ideal king. When he realizes the truth of Sunyata, he becomes so compassionate. That becomes a higher ideal, like Plato's philosopher king ideal. You don't have too many of them. Republic remained an unfulfilled dream, so to speak. Because very soon after Plato, you find in 5th century, Augustine came, and then Christianity, the Christian church, so to speak, developed strong hold over the entire all the monarchies of Europe. That's happening. So maybe something like this happened, I believe. Buddhism itself became an all-negating nihilism. But because if you read the references to Buddhism in Shankaracharya's works, you find he uniformly calls them all-negating nihilists. There is no mention of any of these higher values that Nagarjuna mentions. Nagarjuna was instructing, not that it became a reality in his time. He was giving a hypothetical description of an ideal king, very much like Plato. Maybe there were certain kings. See, Ashoka the Great was an example. He was in 3rd century BC. Then there was this Kushan dynasty, the early centuries of Christendom, you find. So there were great kings at that time, no doubt. There were the Gupta dynasty. They also they patronized Buddhism. They were Hindus. The Guptas of Ujjain, then Vikramaditya, Samudragupta, and others. Harshavardhana was a Hindu king, but he also had a great respect for Buddhist virtues. 5th century AD. And again, Vikramaditya and Samudragupta was earlier. So you find there were great kings who were also highly inspired by Buddhist teachings and practiced all this. So you have to remember, but I think by 8th or 9th century, the picture changed. Exactly for what way? I can give a clear description, explanation why this happened. I don't think Buddhism was responsible for this. Sometimes idealistic philosophical systems and doctrines have a tendency to become dry intellectual concepts. That frequently happens. Idealistic systems of philosophy can sometimes degenerate into dry intellectualism. That must have happened, I believe.
Maharaj, there's a question from the YouTube from Vaidehi.
Yeah.
Who offers pranams to you. And then the question is, if somebody asked Nagarjuna if Buddha has an intrinsic nature, how would he respond?
Yeah, Nagarjuna would not have denied that Buddha Tathagata ideal, Bodhisattva ideal. He would not have denied the fact that it's a real thing. So you have to remember, he was implying the absence of anything inherently existing in this world. In the sense, something that exists for all time without any change. Such a thing doesn't exist. That's what he said. So Nagarjuna did not complete his description of the transcendental. But he refers to transcendental, that is Shunya. After transcending, after going beyond the empirical, which is called Loka Samvritti, with Advaitins called Vyavaharika Satta, the common sense reality, the empirical reality, the phenomenal reality, Loka Samvritti. He says, of transcending Loka Samvritti, you realize Paramartha Satta. The Paramartha Satta, what exactly it is, he called Shunya. But Shunya only is a kind of spiritual experience, that is a non-relational reference to the absolute, non-relational reference, description of the absolute. You have to remember, he says it is impossible to explain Shunya, elsewhere he says. So Sunyata can only be experienced. And that experience, what you call nirvana. Again, you have to say that should be something substantial. So you cannot just define it as just the absence of anything intrinsically real. When Nagarjuna didn't go that far. So there are views among some scholars that Nagarjuna stopped somewhere in the midway. He fully explained the absence of intrinsic nature of phenomenal entities, empirical entities, praditya samutpada, which all belong to dependent origination. Something coming from something becoming the cause of something else, this chain continues. That's all coming and going, not intrinsically real, right? Then what is there beyond that? So there are views that Nagarjuna stopped there without saying. He says Shunya. But as Shunya, if you read carefully, Nagarjuna, again I mentioned, it is the end of thought, end of everything, a non-relational description, a perception of the absolute. When you are totally non-relational, you cannot use words, you cannot compare, you cannot say what it is. Silence is the only way to explain something in a non-relational way. Because language makes you makes you relational. Non-relational means going beyond words. Without linking what you are saying to anything, involving words or thoughts or references or anything. Silence. That's what it is.
So both things would happen. He would acknowledge Buddha's intrinsic nature.
Absolutely.
That the absolute is beyond.
Buddha is a supreme example of a man who experiences Shunya every minute of his life. That's why he is so compassionate, detached. See, if you want to know what Shunyata, you look at Buddha's picture. Very classical picture. He is not indifferent to this world, but he is not very much bothered about this world. You can see so much detachment and so much of compassion. How do you combine these together? So much of detachment, because again it's a non-relational experience, and so much of compassion.
Very clear, Maharaj.
Yeah, thank you.
Swamiji, I was trying to think of whether we could compare Kautilya's Arthashastra with Nagarjuna's Ratnavali, because Arthashastra has also been advised on statecraft.
Yeah.
But probably that's more strategy and realpolitik, while Ratnavali would be more philosophy based.
Yeah.
And probably that's why it didn't get quite as well known, even though it was both around the same time, 3rd, 4th century. I think Arthashastra also was around 4th century. So maybe because of the philosophy and the ethical aspects, it probably didn't get much traction.
You know, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, there is a book on statecraft, mostly. So there is a great emphasis on dharma, ethical values. But I think Nagarjuna's book is more spiritual, because he talks about the spiritual transcendental experience of Shunya, which makes you an ideal king. He is a much more sublime concept of statecraft than Kautilya's Arthashastra. Kautilya's Arthashastra is more elaborate than Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is primarily linked to defense and how to fight without fighting, how to defeat your enemy without fighting, all those things. And then if you read Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, there are certain dark elements in that book. He is pessimistic. For example, he complains that frequently power and stupidity go together. Cruelty, monstrosity and power will go together. This is what is happening around the world. This Niccolo Machiavelli statement.
And I think they also might recommend deception. And deception is something that Nagarjuna would not recommend.
Absolutely, no, never. So in Arthashastra, it is essentially a statecraft. So there are instructions for a king to be an effective ruler with the dharma as a supreme ideal. Dharma as righteousness, not anything beyond that. You should be, but you should also be constantly looking at the back, watching your back. So you find Arthashastra. But Nagarjuna is much more spiritual. There is much more of a transcendental spiritual idealism in Nagarjuna, which you don't find in either Machiavelli, never of course, unthinkable, or in Sun Tzu or Kautilya. So I think, Machiavelli is an extreme case, because it is said that he was outlining what is so happening in Italy at that time, during his time. So he was not visualizing some kind of an ideal kingdom or ideal monarch. He was mostly making observation of what is happening around. The Prince is a very useful reading, but there is something dark about it. Something so, nothing very sublime. Though very realistic from the context of his times. But that should not be an ideal. But there is a lot in Kautilya's system that is idealistic. A king should be even-handed in distributing justice. He should not do injustice. All right, fine. you find, surprisingly, you find there are statements meant for an ideal king in Smrtis. Mahatsubi aparadeshu. So there is a yukta dandam pranandiyam tejit. Rute rajadhigaratu yukta danda prakirti dekha. It's a statement in Yajnavalkya Smriti. I think historically that's the first statement that condemns capital punishment. Dandam pranandikam tyajet. You should give up, you should renounce the tradition of giving capital punishment. Except rute rajadhigaratu. When there is a crime involving the life of a king, it's okay. Capital punishment is okay. But in all other cases, capital punishment should be avoided. You can find advanced, very refined views on justice and law enforcement in Yajnavalkya Smriti. You don't find anything like that in Machiavelli, the prince. But in Kautilya, you find great emphasis on dharma, but you should be careful. You should be able to know what is happening around you, in the king, in the court, or all that. But Nagarjuna is so sublime in his transcendental vision. Say, just imagine when a king realizes the truth of Shunya, then he'll be a wonderful philosopher king. A philosopher king is not part of Kautilya's plan, I believe.
No.
Or just like Plato had this idea, philosopher king. So also Nagarjuna. In Plato, there is not so much spiritual. You may call it spiritual if you want. More of a justice, idealistic. But Nagarjuna, he mentioned again, Shunya. A king should realize the truth of Shunyata, to be able to practice compassion towards everyone, to be free from greed, to be free from violence, to practice ahimsa, non-violence. He should remain detached. And that spiritual detachment is possible only when you realize Shunyata. It's a higher transcendental ideal in Nagarjuna. That is Ratnavali. Okay, thank you. Thank you, very wonderful discussion. Can contribute something from modern jurisprudence, modern statecraft?
Maharaj, along those lines, I was wondering about, because the way you've offered the philosophy and treatises of Nagarjuna is so majestic and so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if they're fundamental parts of the Brahmanical teachings, or whether they're taught at Bellarmine, or whether they're part of the essential scholastic approaches to the trainings of the Vedanta monks, or are we being treated to something special because of your familiarity with the Buddhistic texts?
I did teach Buddhist philosophy, but not as elaborately, which I'm doing now. I used to quote from Mula Madhyama Shastra, but not from Ratnavali or Vigrahavyavartani. I didn't teach those things. But I used to teach some fundamental teachings from Dhammapada, part of Hinayana system, Sutta Bidagana, but not as elaborately as I'm doing now. And in any organization, in Ramakrishna Mission, including Ramakrishna Mission, there are different levels of scholarship. So there is a minimum training given to imparted to everyone. But beyond that, it's mostly depends upon the background you're coming from. If you're already familiar with Vedantic text, with Vedic text, then you find it much more easy to move forward. And I tell you one interesting, not everyone comes with a background in Sanskrit. So it depends very much upon the background I'm coming from. So I had this acquaintance with this ancient language, maybe closer acquaintance than my own vernacular, which I was speaking. So for Sanskrit is maybe dearer and closer to me than the vernacular that I was born into. So it's closer to me. See, the emptiness. This is again Ratnavali. Aham bhavishyami idi chanasti mesya bhavishyati idi balan Bhayatyeda prajnanam bhayavapyagaradi. See, I will not have this frightened desire. So the point is, Nagarjuna says, I won't be there. I am not here. I am that, my true nature is Shunya. Shunya is only reality. This sometimes frightens people. Iti balan bhaityadat. It frightens people. And for the wise people, this experience of Sunyata, it extinguishes, removes all fear. Prajnanam bhayamapya apagaroti. Bhayamapya apagaroti means, if you are a wise person, then you realize Sunyata, all fear gone. But if you are childish in intellectual cultural growth, what happens, then iti balan bhayatyeda. Bhayatyeda means it frightens them. Bhayatyedat prajnanam bhayamapi apakaroti. For the wise persons, bhayam apakaroti removes all fear. For the childish people, it is a cause of fear. For the wise, it is something that removes fear. So, see what a sublime ideal of a king, ideal king that Nagarjuna had in his mind. So, Harshavardhana, who was not a Buddhist, a great regard for Buddhism, he promoted Buddhism, but he was a Hindu king. He was a good example. Vikramaditya and Samudragupta of the Guptas of Ujjain, they are all great patrons of Hinduism and Buddhism both. They were all wonderful examples of ideal philosopher kings in Indian history, you find. Even later century, you find a person like Chhatrapati Shivaji was a great philosopher king. In South India, there was a very great king. His name was the great king in the Vijayanagar. He was a great king, actually. So.
Maharaj, you asked me briefly for a comment on legal statecraft and the like, and I do have an answer.
Yeah.
The most compelling thing, the most advantageous thing in a negotiation is to not compete.
Yeah.
To not actually be in conflict, but in conversation. Yeah. It's very disarming and it works magnificently. And if anyone doubts, the verse that you quoted from Ratnavali just now, jumped up to you also. If you have any doubt about the truth of it, try discussing that in your familiar social contexts.
Yeah.
Find the truth of it, that it'll frighten many people to speak about your non-investment in competition.
Yeah. Thank you this very wonderful rejoinder. You made a great contribution to make this discussion so fruitful. Govindji, Bobby, everyone, thank you so much.